As earlier mentioned, committee, we're going to move amended Senate Bill number 3 to a later date. I think it'll be next Tuesday, actually. And I would now like to call for its second hearing, House Bill 248. I will remind everyone of the quorum that is required in the room, and I will remind everyone of the time limits that we're trying to operate under. We have a little bit less than 2 hours. The first witness to testify in person, Ann Abbott. And second, Autumn Sheaf, please be ready on deck. Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. Please proceed.
Chairman Lips, Vice Chair Holmes, Ranking Member Russo, and honorable members of the House Health Committee, thank you for the opportunity to give proponent testimony on Sub-House Bill 248. My name is Ann Abbott, and I support this bill because my daughter's future matters too. 9 years ago, almost to the day, we essentially sacrificed our daughter's normal life because we were told to vaccinate her for the greater good. In June of 2012, we changed her life because we were coerced into making a medical decision without all the facts and research to help keep everyone else safe and protected. Unfortunately, we did not keep our own daughter safe and protected then. So now we are fighting to keep her from even more discrimination, exclusion, and medical harm. Our daughter had to have a right functional hemispherectomy in 2014 at the age of 3 to save her life from Rasmussen's encephalitis as a result of her first MMR vaccine. The U.S. Department and Secretary of Health and Human Services recently conceded in our vaccine case and confirmed what we knew all along, that her first and only MMR vaccine caused her Rasmussen's encephalitis, therefore leading to her hemispherectomy. Roz was left with half her brain, half her vision, gastro, pulmonary, neurological, and multiple physical disabilities, along with remaining susceptible to febrile seizures when ill. Due to all the medical effects from her vaccine injury, she already faces discrimination and exclusion from typical everyday activities. Her personal health and safety does not rest in the hands of others. It is our responsibility to choose what keeps her safe, and we do not rely on other medical's choices to protect her. Sub-House Bill 248 will prevent Rosalind from being discriminated, excluded, and coerced into even more medical harm. She will continue to enjoy her everyday freedoms in which we are granted at birth. If we do not protect personal autonomy and vaccine choice, we will be denying others like Roz from having the same freedoms as everyone else. Rosalind has already been denied access to stores because she is unable to wear a mask for longer than 15 minutes because she struggles to breathe properly with one on. A lack of proper oxygen could be quite harmful to her. She should not have to provide vaccine status to enter a place of business without a mask. Her safety is just as important as those who do choose to vaccinate or to wear a mask. Roz already has visible physical disabilities from her vaccine injury. She already gets looks, questions, and sadly is ignored by others because of her disabilities. If she has to disclose her vaccine status, this will inevitably cause more negative interaction for her. Her medical choices do not make her less of a person or an unimportant member of society. I fear that more kids, along with their parents, will act negatively towards her if they were to find out she is not fully vaccinated. I don't want her to be denied interaction with others because they fear her vaccine status. That information is for her to disclose on her terms, not forced into. If vaccines are mandated for educational and employment acceptance, Rosalind will be denied the right to an education and employment of her choice. She dreams of becoming a high-risk obstetrics nurse someday. If her medical choices and civil liberties are not protected, she may never have the chance to live out her dream. We already know that many medical settings currently mandate vaccines for a place of employment and can deny exemptions due to public safety. What about her safety? How do you tell your child that what caused her to be disabled is now keeping her from what she wants to be when she grows up? As a mother, I fear she will one day be coerced into vaccination so she is able to participate in society normally. I am scared that what the United States government and medical specialists have already deemed unsafe for her will ultimately take more of her life away. We are raising her to know what happened to her and to educate her to make safe, proper medical decisions for herself. But we all know how peer pressure can lead to making decisions that may be unsafe for oneself. I used to feel that the ADA exemption rights and accommodations would protect her from these possible situations. But recently, we have seen businesses, colleges, and employers denying these rights and exemptions without penalties. If there is nothing to protect my daughter and others' medical exemption rights, we are opening a door to allow future rights to be denied for them. I come here today for my daughter, for others like her, and ask you to support Sub-House Bill 248 and protect their medical autonomy and allow them to have equal opportunities without discrimination, exclusion, or coercion. Thank you.
5 minutes and 1 second. You win the prize. Congratulations, and thank you for helping us stay on track. We're going to start with Ranking Member Russo.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming. And I'm sorry, I did not catch your name, so I was trying to follow along on the testimony. Can you restate your name again?
Ann Abbott.
Ann Abbott. Thank you, Ms. Abbott, for being here. And thank you for sharing your story about your daughter as well. I do have a question for you. So currently in Ohio law, as it relates to vaccines, the exemptions include medical exemptions, religious exemptions, and even philosophical exemptions, which is different. Most states actually don't have that as well. So what is it that this bill includes that isn't already covered under Ohio law, specifically for your daughter? I presume she probably has an exemption. Well, I don't know. Does she have an exemption for school, for example? Could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Chairman Lips to Ranking Member Representative Russo. Yes, she has an exemption. She has a medical exemption. Currently, we do homeschool because of her disabilities, but those exemptions are not being accepted in society in a whole. We go to Menards, and because she can't wear a mask due to a medical exemption, she's not allowed in there. This will keep people from denying her everyday rights to go into a store, to shop in a store. This is not, and if we have to go with a vaccine passport, if she has she's going to be looked at and even denied, because private businesses can deny because that is their choice as a private business. This bill will allow them from keeping her from living everyday rights out as she pleases, even though she is not vaccinated completely, because she has a medical exemption. There's still nothing stopping private businesses from denying her access to their businesses. We see it all the time. It's not just Menards, it's Dollar Tree. I can keep going. I can't take her to Disney World. Well, now I can, but for a year I couldn't take my daughter to Disney World because she couldn't wear a mask longer than 15 minutes. They're a private business. They were able to allow that. If we have this type of a bill here in Ohio, this will allow her to live a normal life.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. And just to clarify, most businesses are not using vaccine passports at the moment. But I guess on the flip side of it, I mean, what is your thought in terms of, businesses being able to protect their employees and other customers? What is your recommendation for what they should do in order to balance, what they want to do or need to do as responsible employers or as responsible business owners to the public that they also serve, in addition to your daughter?
Chairman Lips to Ranking Member Representative Russo, I'm not a legislator. I am not a business, well, yes I am actually. I'm starting a dance studio, so I am a business owner. And as we just heard in the previous bill, it is, we want to create a culture of inclusion. That is what this House bill hearing, or this bill is saying. These vaccines, they're not 100%. We know that. Who's to say that somebody that has the vaccine isn't going to maybe shed, or if you believe in that, or give somebody that COVID. We know that COVID is, we don't know a lot about this vaccine as of yet. But there is no more chance that my daughter is any more diseased or sick or, what do you want to say, a problem to society as somebody that does have a vaccine. But what the problem is I shouldn't and she shouldn't have to disclose the information if she is or isn't vaccinated just to enter a building. That is her information to share whether she wants to and not be coerced into it. And that does not need to be in a business setting as in Walmart. You can say that, oh, she can do drive up. You know, get your groceries, they'll bring it out to your car. Or she can wear a face shield. That was one of them because, you know, making an appropriate accommodation for her. That's not an appropriate accommodation for her. She has a metal plate that sticks up on her head. It hurts at times. That shield rubs that area. That is not an accommodation that she is able to have. Curbside pickup. She will never be able to drive. She will never be able to just run to the store quickly and even get a curbside pickup. She's going to have to wait for somebody to do that or have them bring something to her. These accommodations that these businesses are trying to make, and I mean, wonderful. Thank you for doing that. It doesn't work for everybody. And it's not going to always work for my daughter. What if she is having a killer headache and she needs to get some Advil right now, and she can't go into a store without showing them that she's vaccinated with, so that she doesn't have to put on a mask to go in there? She has a right, like every other human being in Ohio, to walk in a store, whether she is vaccinated or unvaccinated, without showing proof. Thank you.
Committee, additional questions? Hearing none, I have a few just to clean up some details. Ms. Abbott, thank you for being with us today and sharing your family story and personal history. How old was your daughter when she was injured by a vaccine?
She was 2 years old.
Did you know immediately?
Chairman Lips? Yes. Not at the time, let's just put it that way. When she had her vaccine, she started to have seizures 15 days, a convulsive seizure 15 days after her vaccine. That was the first one that we noticed at that time, because before that I didn't know that there was 50 different types of seizures. We looked back at videos because it was right before her birthday party. She was having seizures 2 days after that we didn't know were seizures. But on medical record, it was 15 days after her first MMR vaccine.
You talked about the vaccine injury compensation process. How long did that take? Just give us a little explanation of that process. I'm not sure committee's aware of it.
We filed a VAERS claim about 6 months after her first seizure, because the only difference from a healthy daughter to starting to have seizures with no family history of it was her one MMR vaccine. We did them at one at a time. So we filed that. We were given a lawyer's name by our nurse at the rehab unit at Cincinnati Children's, and we contacted him, and it has taken almost 7 years in court, back and forth. We were just, they just conceded our case last year. So from 2014 until 2020, we've been back and forth in the vaccine courts.
So your family fought the case for 7 years before receiving the award.
Yes.
How old's your daughter today?
She is almost 11. Her birthday is June 17th.
Great. Thank you for those. Representative Liston?
Thanks, Chairman. Just a quick follow-up question to the Chairman's questions. MMR, typically given at about a year. What was the rationale for the timing?
Chairman Lips to Representative Liston. I had done some research, and I had a friend of mine, she had said, have you thought about doing vaccines one at a time? Why are you doing 6 at a time? And, and I said, well, that does kind of seem a little much to me. So we actually started to do DTaP. We started that at age 1. She had no problems with that. And we had discussed that we were going to do MMR starting at age 2. And then at age 3, we were going to do the polio vaccine. We were doing them one at a time because we had read of vaccine injuries, and we just wanted to take precautions in case that was to happen, that we knew exactly which vaccine she would have a reaction to. We just never expected it to be such a major reaction.
Sure. So you were a little sort of skeptical of that to begin with, in terms of vaccines. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
But can I add real quick? I'm sorry.
Of course.
My son, who is 15, we did vaccinate him fully up until he was 8 years old. And that was about when she had her seizures, and we just kind of stopped.
Sure.
Committee, additional questions or comments? Representative Gross.
Chairman Lips to Ms. Abbott, thank you very much. When you made your decision to change the vaccination schedule, which, as you know, we have a regular schedule promoted by the American Academy of Pediatrics and others, did you discuss that decision with your provider, who also agreed with you that this was an acceptable plan?
Chairman Lips to Representative Gross. At the time, we had been going to my family doctor that I grew up with. And when we told him that we were going to do a delayed and selective schedule, he fired us. He told us we were no longer going to be patients because we were not going to follow the schedule of vaccines that is recommended. I had to find a doctor that was okay to work with that. We found a wonderful family doctor who went along with it. So that is the doctor who did our first DTaP, and that is the same doctor that gave her the MMR vaccine. He did not coerce us, he did not degrade us, he did not put us down, and he was fully supportive of our choice. But our first family doctor fired us.
Chairman Lips to Ms. Abbott, and would it be your belief that in your relationship with any healthcare provider that it's a teamwork relationship, or would you prefer a provider who tells you exactly what you need to do, how you need to do it, and you will do it?
Chairman Lips to Representative Gross, it is teamwork. I do not want somebody to tell me what I have to do and what I need to put into my child's body. That is my daughter, that is my son. I have amazing doctors that we have found at Cincinnati Children's that are fully supportive of us, that do not push, do not coerce, do not make us feel bad for not doing any more vaccinations. They can make a suggestion, which, hey, you know what? Fine, make a suggestion to us. But when I say no thank you, they're fine with it, and we go about with our visit.
Thank you.
Representatives, additional questions of Ms. Abbott? Hearing none, thank you very much for sharing your compelling story with us today.
Thank you.
At this time, we'd like to call Autumn Sheaf and announce that Dr. Elizabeth LaFay is on deck. Ms. Sheaf, welcome to committee. Please proceed.
Good morning. Chairman Lips, Vice Chair Holmes, Ranking Member Russo, and members of the House Health Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide proponent testimony for sub HB 248. My name is Autumn Schaaf. I am a family nurse practitioner with 15 years healthcare experience, including 8 years in critical care. I would quickly like to respond to previous question in that this bill differentiates from our current exemptions because it expands exemptions to adults, which is very important to understand. I am here as a concerned citizen to advocate for bodily autonomy and freedom for all Ohioans. I would like to begin with facts regarding vaccine risk. From the CDC, no vaccine is actually 100% safe or effective. The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act established a committee from the Institute of Medicine to review literature on vaccine reactions. This group concluded there are limitations in our knowledge of the risks associated with vaccines. Rare side effects and delayed reactions might not be evident until the vaccine is administered to millions of people. The federal government established the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS, to monitor adverse events following vaccination. If it looks as though a vaccine might be causing a problem, the FDA and CDC will investigate further and take action if needed. Per the Health Resources and Services Administration, since inception of VAERS, 8,028 petitions were determined compensable, totaling approximately $4.5 billion. When a person suffers a life-altering injury, it does not matter how rare it may be. It is significant and it is life-altering. Vaccines given annually or frequently will have higher incidence of adverse effect. This is documented in VAERS. Over half of the compensated injury petitions were from influenza vaccine, 4,104. The second highest adverse effect had 1,273 compensations. Influenza vaccination by far had the highest number of injury claims and compensation. I know 3 women who were hospitalized within 2 weeks of a COVID-19 vaccine. One was admitted into critical care for a week. She was not ill for over a year during the pandemic until after receiving the vaccine. She recovered. Another was in critical care in a coma for over 6 weeks. She has survived, but she will never be the same. I cannot and will not ignore the significant risk that I am seeing with my own eyes. Per the CDC, there have been 4,647 reports of death related to COVID-19 vaccines. The same webpage states a review of these cases has not established a causal link to the vaccine. This leads me to question the credibility of the CDC. RotaShield was pulled off the market in '99 based on 15 VAERS reports in infants. But now, we have over 4,600 reports of death after COVID vaccines, and it is immediately dismissed. What is happening? How is this happening? Rather than pausing, governmental agency has now expanded use to unstudied groups such as children and likely recommending a booster dose in the fall. This is absolutely unacceptable, and so is coercing someone to take a liability-free injection into their body. This evidence shows risk of adverse effect from COVID and flu vaccines up to death. Both vaccines have individual risk. What will happen if people take them at the same time or in close proximity? No one knows. No one knows. The Nuremberg Code prohibits that anyone be mandated to comply with this experiment. I have suggestions for how to address immunocompromised population in this scenario, but time does not allow, so please ask later if you would like to discuss those. To conclude, statutes hold that bodily integrity is preserved even after death. You cannot take organs from a deceased person without their expressed prior consent. If we preserve bodily integrity for the dead, then we must also afford this right to the living. All vaccines have inherent risk. We cannot force a vaccine to prevent a hypothetical illness when it has known documented risk of potentially irreversible adverse effects. We teach our children about body sovereignty and consent because their bodies are their own. It is incredibly invasive to require or force a vaccine. People should not be coerced into taking an invasive medical procedure in exchange to receive an education, to be gainfully employed, or to participate in society. As a human of any age, race, religion, or culture, one right transcends all labels, and that is the right to have control of our own bodies. Thank you for your time. Ohioans must have freedom and the right to bodily autonomy. Please vote yes on sub HB 248. Thank you, and I'm open to questions.
I'd like to start the questioning with Ranking Member Russo.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for being here. So you talked about some of the adverse reactions to vaccines, which certainly can be very real. But my question for you, as someone who's in the healthcare profession, are you aware of any medication or medical procedure that does not have the potential for risk, that is entirely risk-free?
Chairman Lips, Ranking Member Russo, all medical products and all medical procedures have inherent risk. The importance of this bill is that most people are given free choice, and if they decline a recommended intervention, they're not discriminated against. There are no major consequences from that would affect them in an adverse way other than the consequences of their own decision. The situation with vaccines right now is very different. People are losing their jobs if they decline to get a flu vaccine, healthcare workers, and people may lose their job if they do not get an experimental COVID vaccine.
Follow up, please. So because you are in healthcare, what is your recommendation for an employer such as a hospital, a medical office? These are settings where you've got very vulnerable patients coming in to seek treatment, and there is a responsibility of those organizations to protect those patients who are coming in from nosocomial infection, from contagious diseases. So what is your recommendation if they are not requiring their healthcare personnel, if they can't require their healthcare personnel to get a vaccination that would be protective against flu or COVID-19 or any number of infectious diseases that we have vaccines now available to you? What is your recommendation for how they should be protecting patients as well as their other employees?
Chairman Lips, Ranking Member Russo, I think that it is completely within an employer's right to make recommendations about what they think is best for their staff and for any of their clients or patients. I think that employers can provide a reasonable accommodation for people who are unable or unwilling to receive a vaccine. They do this already for disability, religion, any reason that an employee might need a reasonable accommodation. And so one of the ways I think this could be done in a hospital setting, because that is the most concerning area for risk of infection in vulnerable populations, is that they could, I believe, recommend the vaccine, and most healthcare workers will take these vaccines. They can screen patients that are coming in, and if they have certain comorbidities or if they're unable to be vaccinated because of an immunodeficiency or a previous immune reaction, then I believe that in most settings, a reasonable accommodation could include assigning a vaccinated healthcare worker with that patient.
So in that line of thinking, I mean, we hear from, through the chair to the witness, we hear from many healthcare organizations that they already face staffing shortages. In some areas, it could be nursing staffing, it could be any number of our allied healthcare professionals. So, now we're asking them to reassign patients and healthcare providers based on the fact that a healthcare worker won't take a vaccine and they're not able to require that as part of the employment, much like, for example, there are some physical demands of some jobs in the healthcare profession that, meeting those physical demands of the profession are also a requirement. Am I understanding correctly that that's what you are suggesting?
Chairman Lips, Ranking Member Russo, it would not change the staffing assignment as far as numbers of patients. It would simply change how they were directed, which providers were taking care of which patients. So I don't believe that a staffing shortage would necessarily prohibit that accommodation from being able to be completed. And also, you brought up about requirements for a job as far as physical ability. While there is risk of injury with that, it's not an invasive procedure that threatens someone's bodily autonomy. And again, people are given a choice. The one other thing that I wanted to mention as far as employers and how to reduce that liability, I believe that many businesses are already having customers and clients sign waivers, releases of liability. I know when I take my children to the trampoline park, there's a COVID disclaimer that we will not hold them accountable if we get exposed to or get COVID while we're there. I think that hospitals could easily put such a waiver, a release of liability, into their permissions for treatment. And I think that many businesses will do that, not just hospitals. I think many businesses are already doing that, and they can, and if they want to, if they think that would be helpful, they should. And then customers can decide if they want to use those businesses or not. I mean, if you want to go skydiving, they make you sign a release of liability that you may get injured. You can't go if you don't sign it. I think that businesses want to be protected, and this is not something that a vaccine can control or prevent. The vaccines are not 100% effective in preventing this. And so I think that businesses would want this kind of liability exemption for all people, whether they are vaccinated or not. And in that way, it would not be discriminatory, and it would still protect the business.
I would like to refocus committee at this point. This bill doesn't expand exemptions. This is a bill about discrimination and freedom of choice. It's not about expanding exemptions. And to Ranking Member Russo's question about risk-free drugs, and the witness answered there are no risk-free drugs. However, vaccines are the only liability-free drugs. There are no other drugs exempted from liability except vaccines, so I want to make sure we understand the lane that we're operating in here. Let's proceed with Representative Gross.
Chairman Lips to Ms.
Schaaf.
Can you speak to me about perhaps some of the things you're seeing in the professional world with providers around you, whether they are nursing assistants, nurses, nurse practitioners, and physicians, as I know that many, many physicians, nurse practitioners, and nurses are afraid to speak out for their rights to be vaccinated. Can you speak to that regarding the shortages of staffing, and would it be possible that part of our shortage is exacerbated by the requirement to get the COVID vaccine and the flu vaccine, and that have you seen that healthcare providers have actually left the profession?
Chairman Lips, Representative Gross, thank you for your question. So I can actually speak to this personally, an experience that I've had on a previous job. And I have received vaccines in the past, and at a certain point I realized that I was having adverse effects from them. I have sent a personal narrative to all the members of this committee regarding my personal background and why this bill is important to me, so I did not elaborate on that today, but you have that in an email. And so at a point, I've received many vaccines in my life through childhood, through my nursing program, and when I was working. After receiving several flu shots, I developed some nonspecific autoimmunity. And I decided that I did not want to get flu shots anymore while I was investigating my health problems. So the employer that I worked with, at one point, when they knew I was not getting my flu vaccine, they told me I had to wear a mask, which I complied with. And when I asked my manager what I should say to my patients about why I was wearing a mask and other people were not, she responded that I should tell my patient that I was sick. I just had a little cold, and I was wearing my mask to protect them. I didn't agree to do that. I worked in a perioperative setting. I would not come to work sick to take care of patients before surgery. So on further discussion, I was instructed to tell my patients that I was wearing my mask to protect them and to protect me because I did not take a flu shot. Well, that violates my privacy immediately. For a while, I was very direct with my responses, as I was told to be. And there were points that conversations started with other staff, and sometimes even with patients. They would ask me why I didn't take a flu vaccine. And usually my response, pretty typically, would be, I've decided based on my personal health issues that the risk is not worth the benefit, and so I'm not taking one that year. I started to get harassed at my place of employment. After working there for 9 years and really having no track record of any kind of disciplinary action, I started to be disciplined for everything. If I was 1 minute late for work, they pulled the previous 6 months, and any time that I was 1 minute late, they documented it and had me sign. At one point, I had another staff member tell me not to disclose who it came from, but that she was instructed basically to watch me, and if she had any concerns with other patients or conversations with staff, that she should report it. When I went to my manager and I addressed it, and I said, I just wanted to ask, other than my punctuality, do you have any concerns about my performance? Her response was not yet. Freudian slip, I guess. Her response was not yet. I said, oh, are you expecting to? She said, oh, no. I ended up resigning from that position after 9 years because I had a funeral for extended family on a Saturday that I was scheduled to work. I knew the policy specifically stated it was for immediate family over, only that you were allowed bereavement. I called and I resigned over the telephone because I felt very strongly that I would be fired if I called off to go to that funeral. And after working there for 9 years and never being terminated from any job, I did not want that on my record. So I've personally experienced that type of discrimination, that type of pressure, that discomfort for trying to do what's best for myself. And I think that's all I have to say about that experience. I mean, yes, there's a shortage because, partly because the environment is made so uncomfortable that people leave the profession entirely. And I personally could not work in a setting where they required a vaccine because it would make me physically sick. It has. I don't need science to tell me if it could. I know that it has. And so there's really not many places that I could work, even with the shortage, because they would try to require me to have a vaccine.
Representative Liston.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about maybe the reasonable accommodations that I know Rep. Russo had brought up. I guess, you'd mentioned that in a healthcare setting, if there are unvaccinated workers, then there could be changes within, who cares for whom. And my concern, though, is that this bill actually says that an employer cannot ask or require an individual, or request, and it actually even says request on line 12, request an individual to disclose the individual's vaccine status. And then further down, it says that they're not able to ask the individual to do anything or not do anything related to the vaccine status. So as you mentioned, right now hospitals, for those who choose not to get the flu vaccine, they're requested to wear masks to decrease transmission. And I know that you'd sort of made some suggestions on how, with this bill, healthcare settings could make adjustments, but I just can't see how they could do it if they're not allowed to ask or ask them to do something different related to vaccine status. Clearly you have very personal experience with it. How would you rectify those things?
Chairman Lips, Representative Liston, thank you for bringing up that language of the bill. I think that points out actually that it's kind of a moot point that maybe we don't even need to discuss, because if the employer can't ask, they could simply use a waiver of liability, and then it protects the staff from their privacy being violated. It protects the staff from discrimination, and it still allows patients and clients to get the care by simply releasing them of liability related to certain vaccine-related illnesses, such as like flu or COVID right now, are the two vaccines that are likely to be required on an annual basis.
But it doesn't protect their health, right? The patients would still have a higher risk of exposure to flu or COVID, and simply signing the liability away doesn't change that.
Potentially. It's not something that I think that we could quantify. I mean, again, in society, you don't know who's around you is vaccinated for what conditions. So potentially, it may not prevent every infection, but vaccines do not prevent every infection either. They're not 100% effective. So my point was to make that employers could use certain pathways to decrease their liability. There's always going to be a risk for an infection in any environment, and we typically in healthcare take additional accommodations for anyone that's greater at risk, such as gloves, gowns, masks, sanitizing, cleaning their rooms more frequently, isolating them. So there are a lot of other things in place that have been used in the past to still protect people that are vulnerable.
When they're infected, but protecting them from the healthcare providers. We don't glove, gown, mask for every patient, and every patient who's hospitalized is at higher risk of complication.
Every patient that's hospitalized may be at risk of an infection, but we couldn't determine if they'd be at risk from a complication. They could get an infection and develop natural immunity.
But the fact that they're hospitalized indicates they have a current vulnerability. I have a second line of questions, so I just want to be respectful and pause. If we want to, I can be circled back around because the second line of questions is a little bit different. So I'll either continue or.
Okay, we'll put you on a second round of questioning. Representative Representatives, anyone else who has not questioned this witness? So on a second round of questioning, Representative Gross.
Chairman Lips to Ms. Schaaf. Yesterday, I met a children's hospital nurse. I won't say which one because I'll get in trouble. She's afraid. She's been told by this hospital not to speak. She's very afraid that she will be pressured. She's already pressured. She doesn't care. She gets her flu shot. Do you believe that your experience is isolated? I know you probably don't have the numbers in front of you, but are you the only nurse practitioner in Ohio who has had this experience, or do you have some pro-vaccine and maybe non-vaccinated providers who have also been discriminated against, or do you believe you are the only one?
Chairman Lips, Representative Gross, I know for a fact I'm not the only one. I know of people who have been terminated for not participating in the seasonal flu vaccine, regardless of their reason why. And so I know I'm not the only one.
Representative Liston.
Thank you. That was quick. So I wanted to talk about the self-reporting the VAERS system. And a couple of questions. I'll start just with, you mentioned, in this was the 80s, late 80s, when rotavirus was pulled from the market because there was concerns, and I think it was a single-digit number of potential incidences of intussusception, but there was concern, and it was evaluated, and so it was pulled. And similarly, I think we all saw when there was the 5 or so incidences of the potential blood clot, the J&J vaccine COVID was pulled and reevaluated. So, with this, the VAERS system, which is, self-reporting of events after a vaccine, not necessarily related, what's your thinking around the reasoning of why vaccines wouldn't be pulled if there really were thousands of people that are having deaths associated with the vaccine?
Chairman Lips, Representative Liston. It's a great question, and it makes no sense to me that there would be over 4,600 reports of death linked to a vaccine, and while it's still being studied, they would make a statement that there's zero correlation, zero causation related to any of those vaccines. It just does not make sense to me. I cannot make sense of it, that a vaccine would be pulled for 15 events of something that may possibly cause death, but did not necessarily cause death. And while I know that this is reporting database, that's a large number for us to still be giving this. And I still support people's right to choose to take this product, absolutely. But the notion of requiring this in order to work or go to school or to go to any public place is just completely unacceptable to me until we get more information. And even when we do have more information, there will still be inherent risk. And so my stance would still be that people should deserve the right to choose.
So to delve into that number a little bit more, though, these are people that died after receiving the vaccine, any cause, right? So there's been about 158 million people across the United States that have received a dose of the vaccine. If any of them die, right, they're reported into the system, regardless of cause of death, right? So on average, about 8,000 people die each day. So if you think each day 8,000 people die, 150, half of our population has received a dose, at least a dose of the vaccine. It seems reasonable to think that the investigation done may have found that these are deaths that simply occurred. It's a time frame thing, not a causality, right? Because a death occurred after a vaccine and it was investigated and not found to be due to the vaccine, that to me seems like a normal finding with the number of people you usually expect to die every day. Half of the people, right? Half the people that die every day have already received the vaccine, right? If half the population has received the vaccine, and thus would be a part of this database if it were reported, right? So if you're hit by a car, if you die from lung cancer, it's part of these 4,600 people. Yeah?
May I respond?
Yeah.
Chairman Lips, Representative Liston. I do not believe that there's been any vaccine in the history of VAERS that has had this number of reports of adverse events and death. I completely acknowledge that we do not have enough information. We really need these cases to be evaluated more comprehensively to determine if there could be any actual causation, because there's a possibility that there could be some causation. We can't automatically rule out that none of them are correlated.
But I guess I would say that the CDC has said they've investigated it and have found that they're not. So when we see
I don't trust the CDC, and that is a huge number. I mean, really, for 15 cases, we pulled a vaccine. Now we have
Right.
4,600 reports of death. Even if one of them, I mean, that should cause pause, and we're not getting transparency. And so, really, like, if any of those were correlated with that vaccine, then I think we should be pausing both to get more information about the vaccine before we roll it out to untested people, like children and elderly people who were not in the initial studies, and also before we require it or mandate it, potentially in any setting.
So what sort of, like the J&J was pulled because they found that association. And so what's the difference here?
So I guess I would really need to pull the data on where the numbers fall on the other cases, because certainly not all 4,600 adverse events of death were linked to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So that can be pulled through VAERS, and I would be happy to try to get more information to help to look at that data if you would like for me to do that. I do not have that with me today.
Okay. Again, I would submit it's been looked at and doesn't need individual people necessarily when every expert group has concluded this. But
I would disagree. That information is available on VAERS, that people can actually pull and see the adverse events. I mean, some of these adverse events are within hours to days of the vaccine, and people that are otherwise healthy with no comorbidities, with no underlying health issues, that are young, that would not be likely to die.
So I guess it comes down to a disbelief in what those who evaluated the data concluded. Sort of a...
I do not believe that the current information that I presented today has been completely vetted for accuracy.
Okay, thank you.
So I would like to have more information regarding those data points.
Okay, thank you.
Committee, thank you very much. I have 5 questions, but we're simply out of time. We've had 30 minutes on this round of questioning. We still have 5 professional or executive or expert witnesses that traveled from out of state, so we're going to have to move on. I will add and just say that one perplexing issue that we just ended with is 4,900 deaths. A representative tried to explain that, saying, but that could be natural deaths or deaths for some other cause. There was recent protests and rallies across the United States, and the claim was one death is too many, one life is too many, and all of a sudden 4,900 divided by 2, well, that's okay, and then 3 of them died of this, and there's been more than one death. Why wasn't it okay last summer? But now it's okay because it's a vaccine. I'm just saying. So excuse me for getting off track. Ms. Schaaf, thank you very much.
And if
Again, I'll remind the audience to please do not comment. Ms. Schaaf, thank you. We certainly didn't intend for you to stand there that long. You get overtime pay.
Chairman Lips, thank you for the opportunity, and if you have any additional questions for me later, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now are going to have to shorten the time frames to approximately 10 minutes to get all 5 of our professionals in, starting with Dr. Elizabeth LaFay. Dr. Erica Smith is on deck. Welcome to committee. Please proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Lips, Vice Chairman Holmes, and Ranking Member Russo, and esteemed members of the House Health Committee. Thank you for having me here today. I'm Dr. Elizabeth LaFay. I'm a practicing physician. I see patients one by one. I do my best job every day to listen to and educate my patients who are sometimes disclosing information about themselves or showing me physical symptoms that they have never shared with anyone else. That relationship is intimate and personal. Have you ever been to the doctor? Can you imagine yourself vulnerable in an exam room? Significant decision-making arises from these personal conversations, options regarding how best to handle your own health, including disease prevention and processes. This is informed consent. Now imagine there's a government official in the room with us, or your boss, or maybe even a local grocery store owner, weighing in on how you should care for yourself based on their opinions and their needs. In order to make an informed decision, you need to have facts. In our current culture, we have not been afforded all the facts. Scientific discussion is being censored to a level that it's not being allowed. We have been heavily directed by misleading propaganda, for instance, bold statements about how these injections can stop spread and prevent infection in the injected individual, though this has not been proven, and there is real-time evidence to the contrary. We've been largely kept from seeing all the consequences of these injections clearly, though quietly they've been associated with We have been largely kept from seeing all of the consequences that these injections have been clearly, though quietly, associated with, including neurologic damage, convulsions, illness, death, continued spread, and continued contraction of the disease. For instance, according to VAERS, which we've just been recently discussing, a passive and notoriously underutilized reporting system, there had been over 4,000 deaths and greater than 11,000 hospitalizations in those taking the injections through May 14th, reported. Having this information as readily as being told that everything is safe and effective would and should weigh heavily on an individual's own risk assessment during decision-making. As a patient, I'm a doctor's dream. I'm healthy. I choose to live in a way that supports my immune system. I take vitamins, eat whole foods, move my body, actively decompress from stress, and I spend time with family and friends and in nature. Given this work that I put into my health, it might make sense for me to decide to rely on my own immunity. It's not my responsibility to put the health of the greater good before the health of myself as an individual, though that is my decision to make. Maybe you're a patient who's immunocompromised for an uncontrollable reason and consequently unable to rely on your own immune system as readily. Your risk-benefit ratio looks completely different than mine, and you may choose to decide, knowing all the facts, that an injection is less of a risk for your own situation than the illness, and therefore choose the injection. That is your right as a patient. I will not accept the idea that my right to make medical decisions in my own best interest or my family's own best interest is less important than another patient's right to make theirs. The Constitution was not set up to protect the rights of certain populations. It was based on protecting our rights as individuals. As legislators, it's your duty to ensure those rights remain intact. It's always been our right to weigh a decision regarding a medical treatment or therapeutic based on our own individual risk assessment. Autonomy, informed consent. These are the founding principles of ethical medicine. When did it become an employer or university's right to make those decisions for us? When did my health become someone else's responsibility? And to that end, since when do they even have the right to know what choices I have made? Ohioans need the vaccine choice and discrimination protections included in Sub-House Bill 248. I strongly urge the committee members to vote yes on this vital legislation. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll start with Ranking Member Russo. We have about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you, Dr. LaFay. I think I've seen you before in another committee as well, so good to see you again. I had a very interesting conversation, actually, and I can't remember what your specialty of medicine is. I think was it internal medicine? I can't remember.
I'm an emergency medicine physician and functional medicine
Okay.
physician.
I thought maybe it was emergency medicine because I actually had a very interesting conversation with a neighbor who is over emergency medicine at one of our local hospitals here. And I asked him, how are things going now that more people are getting vaccinated? And, what is it looking like in the emergency room in the hospital right now? And we were talking about that a little bit. And he said something that really just sort of struck me. He said, he says, we've had a lot of volume coming into the emergency room, and it's people coming in feeling like they are having an adverse reaction to the vaccine, being very nervous about the vaccine. But when they're evaluated, the majority of those, it's just a normal, it's not a long-term reaction. But people are very nervous about the side effects or potential side effects, so they're coming straight into the emergency room. And I just wanted to, just hear from you. Are you, when we think about self-reporting, and the VAERS system is a self-reporting system, is there the potential that the reason we're having a lot of reports in that system because of this vaccine in particular is because, a lot of people, and I think this is something we should acknowledge and discuss, are very concerned about some of the side effects, and, you may not feel great for 24 to 48 hours. Do you think that this, the self-reported issue and people feeling very nervous contributes to maybe what's reported in VAERS, but also perhaps having people go and seek, whether it be emergency room care or reach out to their provider because they are afraid that they're having an unusual side effect?
Through the chair, thank you, Ranking Member Russo. It is true that VAERS is notoriously underreported. Actually, a government-funded study prior to this year, which I think has probably changed things somewhat, it found it to be 1%. When I approached my director about how to handle vaccinated individuals and concern for injury and what we should be looking for, and brought up to him our duty as medical professionals to be reporting these, because I serve in the ER largely a community that doesn't have a lot of access to medical care, and a lot of them would never self-report. It's actually a very tedious process. Excuse me, his response was, "What is VAERS? I have no idea what you're talking about." And I think that that's more the case. I think largely as a medical profession, we aren't even aware of its existence. So I think the chance of this being over-reported is just not, I don't think there's a chance of it. I do think that there are more visits to the emergency room for anxiety than anything else. I think the fear culture that we've created has been horrific on our culture, and there was more visits to the ER for anxiety around COVID and COVID complications than, and just the management of COVID than anything else. COVID itself, vaccine injury, anything.
Representative Gross.
Thank Vice Chairman Holmes to Dr. LaFay. Thank you so much for your testimony today. Can you speak to me a little bit about, a lot of people say that we need to vaccinate in order to be healthy. And in order to get rid of, it's interesting, we went from natural immunity after having the disease, such as with varicella, to the only way that we can get healthy in Ohio is to get a vaccination. Could you speak a little bit about natural immunity and what you believe, as a professional physician, would be the reality of achieving herd immunity through natural immunity as well as immunization?
Thank you, Doctor. About 1 minute answer. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Through the Vice Chair, thank you, Representative Gross. Just to keep this brief, I think it's been largely ignored, and I think there's a larger concern in those who've had the natural infection that they could have a potential larger reaction to the vaccine itself. So on 2 counts there, I think it's a disservice to society that we are completely taking that off the table. And no one's talking about how to keep yourself healthy. I feel like that really is underwhelmingly talked about in medicine in general.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the considerations for time. All right, Doctor, thank you. We'd like to now call Dr. Erica Smith up.
Thank you for your time.
Dr. Bott is on deck. Thank you. We're tracking 10 minutes for testimony, questions, and answers. Doctor, welcome to committee. Thank you.
Okay, I'm very nervous because I've never done this before, and I am a doctor, but I am a PhD. I'm not a medical physician, so don't ask me any medical questions, please. I've been trying to write down what the appropriate language is. I don't know what it is. I think I'm supposed to say thanks to the chairman, thanks to the vice chair, thanks to the ranking member. Okay, thank you everyone for allowing me to speak today. I have a couple of amendments. The title of my testimony is History Repeats Itself, Parallels Between the Civil Rights Movement and the Forced Vaccination Movement, okay? And then when I said something about HIPAA, I found out today that my statement was not correct, so I changed that to the basic right to privacy, okay? All right, I am the descendant of slaves and indigenous people. And because of that, I am here to urge our representatives to support HB 248 because I remember history and I do not want to repeat it. My paternal great-grandmother, Huida Williams, was born on a plantation in Bullock, Alabama, and she lived there until she was 6. Eventually, she and her family moved north and settled in Ohio. I knew her very well, and I used to visit her a few times a month. She died when I was 11 years old. My maternal grandfather, Joseph Tolliver, had to leave Birmingham, Alabama, with his brother William, because they were so outspoken about discrimination and equality for blacks that they were repeatedly threatened with lynching. So Joe and Maddie, his wife, also moved to Ohio. Prior to leaving the Magic City, which is what my grandmother, Mama Maddie, used to call Birmingham, because she thought when she came north that there were all these cows and fields and stuff. She said they used to wear gloves to go to the grocery store, so she couldn't understand how the North was so much better than the South, okay? But prior to coming to Ohio, she was a Sunday school teacher at 16th Street Baptist Church. Had she and Joe not moved north, she would have been in the basement where those 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, who was 14, Cynthia Wellesley, who was 14, Carol Robertson, who was also 14, and Carol Denise McNair, who was 11, and they were all blown up. And I might not be here today. My parents, Nina and Kenneth, did what they could to stand for justice and equality during the Civil Rights Movement, so that I, when I was born in 1968, was free and had the same privileges under the law as everyone else. But a vaccine mandate will change that. Any student of history clearly sees the distinct parallels between segregation due to race and segregation due to vaccine status. Inherent in this discriminatory practice is the understanding that what is happening in COVID, or whatever the next fear-driven narrative connected to illness is, will become the next battle for civil rights. Government-sanctioned discrimination based on skin color is no different than government-sanctioned discrimination based on vaccine status. The unvaccinated will become second-class citizens just like blacks once were. During the Civil Rights Movement, blacks fought against unjust laws. Today, citizens are fighting against the tyranny of government officials and the bullying from people in their daily lives who expect them to relinquish their God-given freedoms upheld in the Constitution to the state and to obey mandates, mere words of men, which are not laws. In slavery, blacks were masked for several reasons: to dehumanize, to shame, to silence, to isolate, to punish, to emphasize otherness, and to incite fear. Blacks also had to show their papers to prove that they had freedom of movement off and on the plantations owned by their masters. How are the COVID masks, social distancing, tracking and tracing, and vaccine passports of today any different than the tools used by the oppressors of yesteryear? They aren't. Fear and intimidation were used on blacks then, and it is being used in the exact same way on citizens now. Fear is psychological warfare. When the mind is controlled by fear, then one's body and movements can also be controlled. And let me add, what did Roosevelt say? We have nothing to fear but fear itself. Lockdowns, masks, tracking and tracing, and vaccine mandates are abusive because they are systematically stripping away the freedoms of citizens to choose for themselves the best course of action for their health. The idea of mandatory vaccinations for people to keep their jobs smacks of the same abusive legislators that legislators have historically used against whatever people group they perceive to be inferior. Forced vaccinations, medical passports, tracking and tracing are all forms of medical apartheid. And I would encourage you to read Harriet Washington's book, which I have in the back, that's called Medical Apartheid. I have several physicians in my family. A couple of them have taken the vaccine and have had adverse reactions, tremors, and their parents, who are also physicians, have decided that they're not taking it for that reason. One of my cousins went into anaphylactic shock shortly after taking the vaccine. These processes are obviously discriminatory, and it's horrific to think that what people are enduring today is a repeat performance of the past. Will COVID or future illnesses and all that they entail spark a new movement for equal justice under the law? Currently, disparate treatment runs rife across this nation, spreading like wildfire. Demanding in exchange for job security and participation in society the injection of medical treatments that are devoid of both FDA approval and legal recourse when damaging side effects occurs is draconian at best and criminal at worst. What happened to my body, my choice? Don't ask, don't tell. The basic right to privacy. Those who love freedom must act before it's too late. Please support HB 248. Respectfully.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and thank you for being with us today. You did a great job. You didn't seem nervous.
My heart is thumping.
We'll start the questioning to this series with Representative Young.
Thank you very much. The reason I like your testimony is that you're spot on about what this bill is. It's a freedom bill. I am no expert on medicine.
Me neither.
I am no expert on anything other than just taking care of myself and my kids. And as a matter of fact, when I get a vaccine, I pass out. So, but let's talk about the civil rights movement. And I have a question for you. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. Mr. Chairman, to the witness.
I hope I can answer
Do
it.
you see, this is my fear, and you were spot on. Do you see the possibility, because we're seeing there are elements of this around the nation, but do you see this as the next step in wearing a T-shirt that says V on it if you have a vaccine, and a T-shirt that says NV on it where there's no vaccine and you have to sit at the back of the bus?
That's my fear. I mean, I know just from my own personal experience, and again, I have a PhD in English literature. I speak 3 languages. I don't have a background in history. I just know based on the things that my parents have gone through, my grandparents went through, my great-grandparents went through. They taught us the importance of freedom of choice, right? So to me, I think that I'm already seeing things like that. I haven't really worn a mask since all of this started, but that has severely restricted my movement. I don't go to the grocery store anymore, and when I do, I'm praying before I walk in, Lord, please don't let anybody say anything to me because I don't want to have to get crazy so that I can go get groceries. I do a lot of shopping where they're bringing things to me. Now, that has saved me money because I'm not grabbing everything off the shelves. You have the list in your head, the list that you've written down, and then the list that you see as you walk through the store. So that has saved me some money. I also do everything online, and then they bring the groceries to me. But the only places that I really go, because I don't have a job anymore where I actually have to leave the house, and I probably won't have it after this because I took off and they told me that I couldn't, right? But this was this important to me for me to come today, and I might lose my job because of it. But the reality of the situation is you've already started creating a 2-tier society. There are people who cannot move about freely. I bought tickets to go see Sting to take my sister for her 50th birthday last year, and the concert was canceled. Now, I paid almost $1,000 for 3 sets of tickets. Now, because of all of this COVID vaccination and stuff like that, and you've got to show proof of your vaccine, I probably won't be able to go to that concert. See, to me, I know people who fought to be free. And I'm not trying to make this a racial issue, but I would argue that there's a disproportionate number of people in this room who do not have a history of that. And so they take their freedom for granted, right? I never thought that I would have to fight this fight, but I'm willing to do it because I think that we're already starting to see that. In this past year, I go to church, I came here, and every once in a while I'll creep into a store and hopefully, like I'm the invisible man, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, hopefully nobody will see me as I walk through to try to get what I need to get. I don't want to live like that. To me, freedom is more important than anything else. And I think that it's sad that we're even in a situation where we have to write a bill in order for people to be free. We are in the most powerful nation on this planet. It was created by people in 1776 who fought against tyranny in government. And now we're revisiting the same types of things because people are too afraid to stand up and say that they want to be free. I don't know if that answered the question, but...
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Before we proceed with questioning, there needs to be a clarification. The chair likes Sting.
So you want my tickets? Is that what you're saying? You're gonna have to sit with my sister and her.
I'm just saying.
I
In
love him
case
too.
we could talk later. So again, we're off track, and it's Representative
Sorry.
Young's fault. It's not my fault. At this time, Representative Liston.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. Just sort of clarification about the scope. This bill applies to all vaccines, not just COVID. It applies to the meningitis meningitis vaccine that young people get when they go to college. It applies. There are many parts of the bill that applies to school vaccines. would you apply your testimony to those as well? Those have been around for a long time.
No, I would not. And the reason why is because the vaccine or the shot or whatever you want to call it that's connected to COVID is not being treated in the same way as things in the past. We were not told, one of my aunts is a physician. The first 3 kids, she vaccinated them with all the vaccinations and went through the recommendations. She saw some issues, and so with her 4th child, she did the same thing that Ms. Abbott did. She did 1 shot at a time. But we're still not in a situation where, with previous shots, based on my limited medical experience, we're not in a situation with those types of treatments as we are with COVID. You've never had to prove that you had meningitis shot in order to be able to go to the grocery store. Representative Russo mentioned the idea that, well, we have all of these things in Ohio that say, well, if you've got these exemptions, then you shouldn't have to do this. I can tell you from personal experience, my husband has a medical exemption, and his school told him that they weren't going to accept it. They said about his physician, well, she's a nice lady, but they don't have medical degrees. They don't know what my husband's history is. He's forced to wear a mask every day, even though he has a medical exemption. So this stuff about, oh, well, we've got all this stuff in there to protect people, it's not protecting people because people don't care. Even the governor said, well, you have to understand there are going to be some people out there, this was last year, who have exemptions, and we need to be, kind to them. We shouldn't ask them or whatever. People still ask. So to me, I don't see how, if you're thinking about historically what's going on in the United States and internationally, that this is not going to end up, if people are forced to do things against their will. We have no sovereignty over our own bodies, and to me, that's not civil rights.
So just refocusing then, apply the testimony to the COVID, but we're not really talking about school children vaccines, et cetera, as what you're discussing, I want to apply your testimony to the correct portions of the bill.
Okay.
And so, yes, am I right on that? That, just to clarify, what you're talking about is the COVID component, not the broader components.
I'm talking about the COVID component.
Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I repeated myself. Sometimes I do that just to make sure that my point, my thoughts
But I
came
think
out
any
clearly.
future thing, if it's going to be handled in the same way, nothing has been handled like no other vaccines have been handled like this one.
Sure. Thank
And
you.
that's my problem
Okay.
with this. It's a slippery slope.
Representative Gross.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Chairman Lips to Dr. Smith. We know now that there are 14 vaccines required to immigrate into the United States. We also know that there are 3 exemptions, conscientious, religious, and medical exemptions for all of those vaccines to immigrate into the United States. Can you tell me, if we would provide those freedoms to stay free in Ohio, can you tell me your thoughts about staying here? Or can you surmise perhaps about what would happen to Ohio if we do not provide freedoms in Ohio? Is it possible that things could change and we would leave Ohio and return back to states such as Florida?
I think that that's very possible. I have friends at the church that I currently attend, and they came from war-torn countries in Russia, Ukraine, places like that for freedom. And one of the things that they've been talking about is, if the United States falls and we no longer have the freedoms that we have so graciously enjoyed because of people who have stood up for freedom, where will we go? I right now can't leave to go to Florida, but if things change in Ohio, I would be willing to leave. I want to be someplace where I can be free. It's as simple as that. And if Ohio can't provide that, then so far we still have the ability to move freely. But with vaccine passports showing our papers, like, to go from one plantation to another, Massa wants to see your papers or whatever else, if that ends up being the case, then we won't be able to leave to go someplace else.
Thank you.
You are welcome to go to Warren County.
Listen, I just moved from Cuyahoga County to Medina, and the reason why I moved to Medina was because they were more conservative and they were more free. I can shoot on my land, You know, it only takes my husband a half an hour to be able to get to work. If we had moved to someplace else, I would have moved further, you know, if I had been able to, but we couldn't. So,
Representatives, thank you for your patience and understanding, but we are going to move. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for being with us today. At this time, we'd like to call Dr. Sunil Bott with Michelle Krinsky on deck. Dr. Bott, thank you for being with us. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Lips, Vice Chair Holmes, Ranking Member Russo, and members of the House Health Committee. Let me begin by thanking you all for allowing me to speak here today. Let me also thank you and some of the other people in the crowd for having stolen half of my speech here, but that's all right. Repetition is key. I would like to voice my support for the proposed legislation. As a practicing infectious disease physician, I recognize the importance of shared decision-making between clinicians and their patients. Indeed, the American Medical Association's list of patients' rights codify the importance of self-determination. I believe it's Section B of this proposed legislation that merely restates what we all know to be true. Patients make the best choices for their health when they're informed and empowered as opposed to coerced. This legislation, as far as I understand it, was crafted in response to ideas being discussed at various levels of government and in various sectors of society concerning the need for a form of vaccine identification for COVID-19. I'd like to mention 3 reasons why I disagree with the public identification of vaccination status. The first is that, to my knowledge, there's really no mandatory intervention placed on the citizenry in regards to the other top causes of death in the state of Ohio, such as diabetes, heart disease, influenza. Instead, in the context of a trusted physician-patient relationship, people generally make decisions that are best suited for their unique situation. I see no reason to really deviate from this tried and true formula. The second reason is that vaccine status alone provides an incomplete portrayal of herd immunity. The threshold to obtain herd immunity is based really on how many people can be potentially infected by a single case of the disease. Most data that I've seen to indicate this reproductive number, as we call it, falls between about 2.5 and 3. That puts the herd immunity threshold at about 67 to 70% of the populace. Unfortunately, the message that has been made public is that immunizations are the only path to this ideal. In truth, this number is arrived at by adding together both people who are in receipt of the COVID-19 vaccine, but also those who have actually recovered from disease. To date, according to the state of Ohio data, about 53% of the populace has either recovered or received at least 1 dose of the vaccine. Importantly, though, this statistic does not include the upwards of 20% of all cases which could be considered asymptomatic cases of COVID-19. If that were included in those numbers, that number could be significantly higher. If these numbers do portend an attainable immunity goal, there'd be no need to foist a vaccination upon an unwilling member of society. The third reason actually concerns the length of immunity that one appears to obtain by either acquisition of COVID-19 or from the vaccine. The latest data indicates that people who have recovered from COVID-19 harbor immunity for at least 8 months. Indeed, the trend of the graph actually seems to indicate that people will have immunity for much longer beyond that. In a similar fashion, those that have received a vaccination seem to have evidence of immunity that lasts for at least 6 months, and again, likely much longer. If that's indeed the case, it would obviate the need to delineate those who received a vaccine from those who have not. In closing, vaccines have been a boon to societies around the globe. They have helped save millions of lives. However, I would echo the words of the writer and philosopher George Santayana. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. In 1813, the federal government passed the Act to Encourage Vaccination. Unfortunately, at that time, the landscape of society was changing and the public was becoming more distrustful of credentialed professionals. That act was repealed in 1822. Today, polls seem to indicate that less than 50% of the citizenry trusts local and state health departments. I've worked to build relationships with my patients, some of whom come from sectors of society that really don't have high levels of trust for the medical profession. I would loathe to see any of their private medical decisions be made public or they be discriminated against for having chosen a path of care that was best for them. I believe that this bill is timely and that it'll send a message that we truly do believe in the fundamental right of autonomy. Thank you. Can I decline questions?
Yes. Yeah, you sure can.
Is that a lie?
That's a lie. I'm a politician, we're allowed to lie. Committee, who would like to start questions? Ask a whole bunch now. We're on a time limit. Dr. Liston.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your testimony and obviously the work that you do to build relationships with patients. So this bill, you reference the American Medical Association and organized medicine in this. Do you have a sense of organized medicine's stance on 248 and whether you're sort of representing what that might be?
I myself do not. The colleagues that I have are pretty much all over the place in terms of how they feel about COVID vaccination and offering it to the public versus foisting it on the public. So I couldn't give you an actual trend of the medical profession.
I would love to tell you that ACP, OAFP, so American College of Physicians, American Association of Family Physicians, American Association of Emergency Physicians, and pretty much every letter I can think of has really come out against this bill, including nurse practitioner professionals, because of the harmful nature. But part of the challenge, I think, with it is the impacts on vaccinations overall. So this bill says that universities can't ask students coming into the dorms to get a meningococcal vaccination. As an infectious disease doctor, any thoughts about that?
So, again, I think when we talk about taking care of people, we try to develop a hierarchy, if you will, of how you approach patients. So what I've always been taught since medical school is the person in front of you comes first. I will have my thoughts, and they may be strong in terms of how do I actually care for this person, what advice should I give them, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's them, their autonomy, the issue of beneficence, the issue of letting them decide for themselves what should occur in their lives. I can't foist that upon them.
So in that setting, though, I mean, the university is simply saying, hey, this protects our student body.
Right.
The R naught on meningococcal vaccine, what is 10 or so? So one individual
Right.
who brings it into a dorm, on average, would infect 10
Correct.
with a bacterial infection that has a death rate over 10%, right? So that one person's decision should they get it, lead to, on average, the death of one of her friends or people on the floor.
Correct. It could have potentially, so I'm not doing the proper, chairman lips to represent.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not
For sake of time, of course. Correct. So in that instance, I would, regard that as something that I would strongly recommend that they consider this vaccination. Now, to be honest, I take care of adults, so I probably would never see those people in general because they're quite young. But I would recommend that for them. But I cannot foist that upon them. That's the difference, I think, of what this bill is trying to deal with. That's my sense of it, at least.
Sure.
Does that answer the question?
So, and then the university, who would think about all of their students, knowing that one person not getting it could lead to the death of someone on that floor, just numbers-wise, doesn't have the right to ask for vaccination status.
According to this bill, that'd be correct.
Okay. And what your beliefs are as well. And
No, actually, to clarify, they have the right to ask. They don't have the right to force, I think is the difference here. So I
line
think that's-
111 says not ask, not request.
They can have a written policy, but it can't be a mandated policy because that's just forced discrimination, I believe.
Well, so I, again, would love the clarification on that in the future, maybe from LSC,
Right,
because
yeah,
line
we'll do
111. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I'm just trying to center it back to this is a freedom of choice, non-discrimination bill. That's the whole point, and everybody's done a great job. I'm proud of everyone. Ranking Member Russo.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Bott, for being here. So, my question, I want to bring it back to, you work in a healthcare setting as an infectious disease doctor. I mean, in a healthcare setting, particularly in a hospital, the amount of resources and time that we spend trying to prevent nosocomial infections in the spread of that in a healthcare setting. And one of the approaches, other than wearing masks and the disinfection, one of the approaches is that many facilities do require vaccinations for their employees because of the patients that you're treating, the setting that we're in. So, again, this bill would prohibit, even in healthcare settings, those employers from, requiring that to protect patients and their other employees. And I guess I would like for you to respond to that, as an infectious disease doctor, and knowing how much effort and energy is put into preventing nosocomial infection spread in a hospital setting, how it gets reconciled.
Right, so you're correct. Over the years, several studies have shown that the vast majority of nosocomial infections are somehow tied to the hands of healthcare workers. It's our fault, right, iatrogenic. So one of the things that was interesting to me was that earlier on in this epidemic, well before we had vaccinations, there were studies that were performed in hospital settings compared to the general citizenry that said, who's actually getting COVID, right? Forget about giving, but getting COVID. And they found that, the healthcare workers, because of all the masks and the gowns and everything that we wear, were about 50% less likely to acquire COVID, even though they were in a COVID ward, compared to the people that are out there and mixing with other people. So then you start thinking, well, in general, once an infection control program gets a hold of something, it becomes very difficult to wrest it away from them. So I'll be very surprised over the course of the next year or two if healthcare systems, clinics, things like that, actually start telling their workers, you don't have to wear shields, you don't have to wear goggles, you don't have to wear masks, because we wear them universally for every patient now. The COVID patients, we wear an extra gown and an actual shield, not necessarily a goggle per se. So I think it's really more the mechanical barrier that's going to really lead the way in terms of protecting both the patients that really don't want to get disease X on top of their cabbage surgery, as well as protecting healthcare providers themselves when they're in the inpatient or outpatient setting.
So quick follow-up through the chair, Dr. Bott. Actually, I agree with you. I think that, what we've seen happen in hospitals in the last year is a real case study. And when you do infection control properly with the proper equipment, we've seen, I think, a tremendous reduction in just overall in nosocomial infections and spread, and particularly when we saw it with COVID. That said, the level of protection that is necessary without the vaccine to make that happen, I don't think on the flip side of that, we're going to expect businesses, for example, in the general public, to require their personnel, to continue to be masked, or ask their customers. We've even seen it now. People can go in without a mask, and we're in this room without a mask in settings, and partially that is, not partially, that is due to the fact that our vaccination rates are increasing. So it's what is the... Either we go through the steps to prevent infections with masks, gowns, et cetera, or, we ask people to be vaccinated.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would say to that is to appeal to history. So when you look at historical issues related to infection control, we've never really taken infection control in the hospital setting and taken it out, even to the outpatient clinics. That's been very uncommon. So to put it out into the public, that's been very rare that I've ever seen, at least in my lifetime. So for example, we don't really talk about this in the context of flu season, where we ask people who are going to Myers or Menards to wear a mask, for example. We've never done that before, to my knowledge, or for any other infectious disease for that matter.
Through the chair to the doctor, but you would agree that this is a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic situation that we're talking about with COVID?
Yes, it's very
we've certainly
unique.
had other pandemics, but not to the extent that COVID-19 has ravaged the world.
Unless you're 100 years old.
Unless you're over 100, which no one in this room is. Thank you.
Representative Gross.
Chairman, to Dr. Bott, thank you so much. When you think of immunity in a population such as Ohio, is the medical opinion that the only way to achieve immunity is through immunization?
No. When you talk about immunity, there's different aspects to immunity. So immunity can be garnered by natural acquisition of disease, and that happens every year when people get different respiratory viral pathogens, certain GI pathogens, things like this. So no, I wouldn't say that immunization is the only way. Yes. So there are, estimates that up to, as mentioned before, up to 20% of people potentially could get COVID with asymptomatic disease. If you include the mildly symptomatic, that's going to bump it well over 60% of cases. Does that answer your question?
To achieve herd immunity, do we have both disease plus immunization, or do we only achieve herd immunity through immunization, as been reported and often put?
No, for any disease, you want to take a conglomerate of people that have had disease X, whatever that happens to be, and add it to the people that have been able to receive a potentially helpful vaccine.
So it's a false statement to say that only those who are immunized are immune?
Correct. That's right.
Representative White.
Chair Lips, Doctor, thank you for your testimony today and for providing those statistics and things like that. I appreciate it. One of the questions I had, though, if I'm understanding this correctly, you were stating that the masking of medical providers helped prevent them from spreading COVID in the hospital setting.
Sorry, acquiring. So these are people that have specifically been relegated to working in COVID wards, whether it's the ICU or non-ICU setting, and then comparing those people, those workers, to people that are just out in the general community.
Would you say that the spread as well was helped to be prevented based on their masking? Because my question is about, the one thing I wondered about the bill in relation to the healthcare setting was that you are not permitted to require someone to have a facial covering, and so I'm not sure if I'm understanding the language of the bill correctly.
Yes, so everything that they wear also helps prevent the spread to the next person, because once you leave a room, you have to disrobe, you have to clean the materials that you've been using, the mask, whatever it happens to be, before you go to the next patient. So there are wards, nowadays at least, there's wards where you'll have COVID, non-COVID, COVID, non-COVID. Well, when you leave the COVID room, you have to disrobe and change things before you go to the next room. So yes, to answer your question, yes, that has reduced the spread as well.
Thank you.
We're out of questions, so we still have a few people that want to talk, but you're using up the time committed to the additional people, so I'm going to ask you to be brief, Dr. Liston.
I know this is brief, but I think everyone would love to hear your response here. We had some discussion about VAERS and the reports there, and the CDC's conclusion that of those 4,646 potentially after immunization deaths, a review of available information, death certificates, autopsies, medical records has not established a causal link to COVID-19 vaccines, and there's been some skepticism. Do you have any thoughts on the CDC's analysis of the vaccines?
I do not have much thoughts on VAERS. I have very little interaction with VAERS. I have tried to use VAERS a couple of times, and I think other people have succinctly stated that it's very laborious and difficult to navigate. So I can't really speak to issues related to VAERS.
But would you trust the CDC's analysis of the reports using their death certificates, autopsies, and medical records?
If they release the methods by which they've analyzed those, that's what I like to see, is their actual data. Like, how did you actually analyze these different cases? That's what I do. I look at data. That's what most physicians do. So I'd like to see, I don't want to take people at face value, not to say that they're being dishonest or lying, but I'd like to see, well, how did you come up with that? Because anytime you're going to put a publication out there, it should come under scrutiny to see, have you done it validly?
And has typically CDC done things validly?
So my experience with CDC is mostly in the area of international travel medicine, Yellow Book, those types of things. Those have been pretty good. In terms of COVID-related issues, I rarely actually go to the CDC because there's other resources and personal experience and people that I have that are colleagues that are knee-deep in COVID that I learn from, people on the ground rather than people in Atlanta, if you will.
Okay. So you doubt their methodology at this time?
I can't say I doubt it. I'm just not familiar with it because I don't know what their methodology is.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Young.
Goodbye.
I thought it was 10 minutes.
Representative Liston scared you off there, but I'm joking. Is the COVID virus a virus or disease? Because it started out in the narrative of fear to be a virus, and then it turned into a disease. So what is it?
So novel coronavirus, or SARS-CoV-2, is a virus of the coronavirus subfamily, kind of related to the old SARS we had about 2006, 2004, somewhere in that area. So yes, it is a virus that causes a disease in humans. The issue is that there are obviously certain sectors of society that have what we call a hyperinflammatory state. So this virus seems to infect people, but then those people that have that hyperinflammatory state, uncontrolled diabetes mellitus, heart disease, obesity, these types of things, it just sets off our immune system to become hyper-responsive, and that's kind of what sets things in motion for patients.
But it's a virus.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, it's a virus.
Okay.
Ranking Member Russo.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. While I have you here, I mean, we've talked about this issue of vaccination versus natural immunity. Can you please, given your expertise, talk about the role that some of the variants that we're seeing emerge where we see natural immunity because they don't have access to the virus? What happens with the variants and some of the mutations and what we're seeing in other countries where they don't have access to the vaccines like we do here in the United States?
Right, so typically what I've seen is once you get virus X, many viruses, they just have a natural path of mutations. So when you talk about the India strain or the Great Britain strain or whatever, it's not that those were necessarily isolated to those countries and then imported here. They just discovered it first, but we have it here. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about countries that don't have access to the vaccine, can people get reinfected with COVID? Yes, they can get reinfected with COVID, but the data seems to be all over the place. Some people, because they have pre-existing immunity from having had COVID before, they'll respond very quickly and get over it. Other people seem to have a spiral effect, and nobody can really delineate why, at least from the data that I've seen.
So real quick to that, but what we are seeing with some of the variants certainly is that the vaccine provides more protection than the natural immunity. Is that correct to say with some of the variants?
That would be difficult to say. I haven't seen a lot of data specifically with reinfected people where researchers have delineated original variant, second variant, third variant, and said, well, let's measure their immunity levels. I haven't seen that data come out yet. Okay. But in relation to vaccinations, the vaccinations do seem to have pretty good, robust effectiveness against a variety of different variants.
Okay, thank you.
Doctor, thank you for being with us today. We heard about nosocomial infections or invasive fungal infections being common. Or is there a vaccine for MRSA?
No.
Is there a vaccine for C. diff?
No, it's not released, and it kind of keeps running into roadblocks, so no.
Is meningitis a known side effect of vaccines?
Wow, that would be a very uncommon, but yes, it can be a known side effect.
Thank you for your patience today. Thank you for your professionalism, and thank you for sharing with the committee. Oh, Representative Catrona.
Thank you. Through the chair to the witness. First of all, I appreciate you coming down here, and I myself, I run the only infectious disease medical practice in 3 counties, Trumbull, Mahoney, Columbiana County. And so one thing that we saw was about 33% of our intake in the hospital was actually coming from nursing homes and places like that. And I'm sure you probably had something very similar down here. You're from Columbus?
Yes, early.
In the Columbus area. So do you think it's a concern that if you have people that are working in those types of healthcare facilities, whether it is a hospital, whether it is a nursing home or long-term care facility, do you think that it could be a potential problem or concern if there are no vaccination requirements whatsoever for the caretakers or for the people that are working in those establishments, the nurses, the physicians, things like that? I'm curious to see what your thought is on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the difficulty with answering the question is that there's vaccines to a variety of pathogens that are out there. So you really want to delineate in your population, in your nursing home, what would they be at greatest risk for based on their age, comorbidities, things like that. And those are the things that you'd want to say, we probably want to see if our workers would get vaccinated. My sense is, just being in the medical field, is that most people that work in the medical profession want to do no harm. So they're willing to say, I'm going to get vaccinated for the protection of my patients.
And just to follow up with that, so with this piece of legislation, though, it would basically prevent that from happening. So I just, from what you were kind of indicating, I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so I could be wrong, but my understanding is it wouldn't prevent people necessarily from getting vaccines, but it's more of a communication issue, privacy issue, saying, well, I got it, but it's none of your business. I could be wrong about that.
So, and I'm all about privacy and healthcare privacy. My understanding of the legislation, though, is that an employer would not be able to say to work here in this in this facility, in this hospital, in this long-term care facility, that they would not be allowed to make that a requirement. So, like in St. Elizabeth Hospital, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with it, in the Youngstown area, they make it a requirement that people have the flu shot to work in that facility. So, my only concern, I guess, or my thought is, I like you, want to make sure that the best care possibly can be given. I just, with this legislation, I think that, that might create a carve out for that, so that therefore, there wouldn't be the ability to say, hey, if you're a physician, you want to work here at this hospital, you must receive, X, Y, Z. Do you think that could potentially be a problem, given your experience in ID and your experience in the healthcare industry?
I think for the minority of workers, they may choose that route. But my experience has just been that the vast majority of people that work in that setting would say, I think I should get this.
Good point. And I would just say, and I can't speak for every place in Ohio, but back home, I think roughly we're looking at about 40%, though, that, basically it's going, so you have physicians, which is something like 95% have gotten the vaccination, and then you go to nurse practitioners, something like 88, 85%, something like that. And then as more and more you go further down, it's less and less, so then you have nurses, and then, if you go down through that line there, you're seeing less and less people actually getting the vaccine. And so, when I think about, like, nursing homes, I'm thinking, if you have, like, nurses' aides or you have anything like that, and they're around these people that are extremely vulnerable, as you know, that could potentially be, just if that would be potentially a problem, if nobody was going in there getting vaccinated because of that. So
right.
Thank you.
Yes. So the other thing to think about is on the other left side of the ledger, are the patients themselves getting the vaccines to protect themselves, right? And then if you look at the nursing home, for example, as its own subpopulation, I guess, then you'd want to say, well, what's the critical threshold for us to make sure that we don't have any types of outbreaks or hurt any of our patients? And that has to be done at that level, obviously. And then the third aspect, which we've talked about before, is a little bit when physicians, nurse practitioners, whoever else goes in to see patients, what are they doing in terms of on top of universal precautions anyways to prevent spread? So we don't want to necessarily treat vaccinations as a panacea, as if they're 100%.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Welcome.
Final question for this witness, Representative Lepore-Hagan.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Doctor. I'm baffled. I am. I mean, you are a doctor. You know so much more about medicine than I do. How can you say my independence, my freedom is more important than what your knowledge and everything you did to get to where you are? I think that how can you weigh that? Is that disingenuous to your patients? Thank you.
No, so that would only be disingenuous if I didn't offer my book knowledge or offer my advice or offer my experience. But at the end of the day, I think it really depends on that person that I'm dealing with in front of me as they go off to their community that I don't live in, the people they interact with, their sphere of influence, if you will. So I cannot speak to that level of insight. Only they can know that level of insight, if that answers your question.
Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise. We really appreciated having you. Thank you. Committee, not so good on that round. We went over. So we have 2 witnesses left and only 10 minutes, so we're really going to have to pay attention to what we're doing here. I'd like to call Michelle Krinsky, and then our final witness at that point would be Donna Kazee. Ms. Krinsky, thank you for being with us. Please proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Lips, Vice Chair Holmes, Ranking Member Russo, and members of the Health Committee, thank you for allowing my testimony today. Thank you as well to Representative Gross for sponsoring this very important bill. My name is Michelle McAllister Krinsky, and I am a registered nurse from Cincinnati. 3.5 years ago, in November of 2017, I was terminated from my place of employment for declining a flu shot. At that time, I had been an RN for 35 years, 29 of those years at the same hospital in the same unit that I was terminated from. Because of my vegan ethics of non-harm and a prior adverse reaction to the flu shot, I submitted a conscientious/religious, religious exemption in the fall of 2016. Halfway through flu season, I was told my exemption was denied and that exemptions would no longer be accepted in my unit. At that time, I was given an ultimatum to get the shot or be fired. I scheduled a meeting with my manager and nursing administration to explain my ethics and reasons for concern. I asked if I could wear a mask for the remainder of flu season, which had always been hospital policy. I was told that this was no longer acceptable since masks did not adequately filter viral particulate. I now find that this statement quite especially ironic since we have just spent the past year requiring completely healthy people to wear a face covering whenever they leave their home. I asked to take a non-paid leave of absence for the remaining 2 months of the specified flu season. This was also denied. The choice was very clear: take the shot or be fired. There was no middle ground. The fact that I was being forced to take a biological product containing a list of questionable ingredients, as well as animal DNA, was very distressing to me, but I felt I had no other choice. I love my job, and financially we depended on my salary to help support our family. Against my better judgment and my intuition, I reluctantly took the injection. 5 days after receiving the vaccine, I woke with a high fever, body aches, chills, and a cough. Basically, I had flu symptoms, which then turned into bronchitis. I was off sick for 2 weeks. I was so frustrated that I had been coerced into taking this shot that had made me ill, someone who prides themselves with being well and proactive with their health. Fast forward to October of 2017. Once again, it was time to receive our annual flu shots. The staff was made aware that no exemptions would be honored. Take the shot or be terminated, period. I knew after 2 years of consecutive adverse reactions to this vaccine, along with a complete disregard for my ethics, I would no longer take the shot. At this time, I was completely unaware of my rights to file an exemption under Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Another meeting was scheduled with my manager to no avail. On November 17th of 2017, my position of 29 years was terminated. It didn't matter that I had been an exemplary employee with an excellent work record. Not one medication error, not one patient complaint in 29 years. I was known to be dependable and flexible, a compassionate, empathetic member of our team. None of this mattered. All that mattered was I was not willing to comply with a mandatory policy that I was not comfortable with. Within a 24-hour period, my nursing career, my income, my ability to save for my retirement, and my insurance benefits were gone. How is it okay that a hospital can take away your conscientious concerns, your ethical and religious rights to decline an injected biological product? Why is it up to someone else to make those determinations? Why is no not a good enough reason? None of this made sense to me for a product that has a 35 to 40% effectiveness rate on a good year. But after doing a little research, I quickly found this mandate has little to do with health and patient protection, but a lot to do with employee compliance and Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements. It's interesting to me how it always seems to come back to financial interest. The hospitals and the government never seem to promote true health. They only want to push a pharma product that has nothing to do with health, but everything to do with a multi-billion-dollar vaccine agenda. Honestly, I find it hard to believe that this discussion needs to take place concerning the COVID injection. How can anyone force an experimental injection that does not have FDA approval? It's only being given under emergency use authorization. A product that has absolutely no long-term testing, no liability, and in the first 5 months, according to the VAERS database that we have talked about on the CDC government site, there have been over 4,000 deaths and combined 200,000 adverse events and injuries. This amount of risk for a virus that has a higher than 99% recovery rate in the general population. I've always been a proponent of choice and informed consent, and I can tell you that true informed consent is not being given, and I can say that for being in the industry for as long as I've been. I'm only one of many healthcare workers that's been affected by mandated vaccines. After I was terminated, I received hundreds of messages and emails from nurses in similar positions, even pregnant employees calling me in tears asking for advice because they were forced to take a vaccine with complete disregard for the potential risk to their developing babies. For me, the loss of my job has caused a tremendous financial hardship for my family. We quickly went through my retirement savings just to maintain our home and the bills that needed to be paid. So many of my coworkers had concerns as well, but were fearful of retribution if they spoke up. Needless to say, the hospital made an example out of me. In conclusion, I'm very grateful for this much-needed discussion. We need legislation that would support an individual's right to informed consent in the workplace, as well as society in general. Whether or not to be vaccinated should remain an individual's right to bodily autonomy based on prior adverse reactions, religious convictions, and ethical or conscientious concerns. Representative Gross has said that this is a freedom bill, and she is so right. When we lose the ability to make our own health choices, we have lost freedom in the truest sense of the word. Anytime there's a risk involved, we must have honest, informed consent and the ability to make the most appropriate choices for ourselves and our families. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony and your story. I had learned of your story several years ago in our first periods of HB 193, which
Right.
turned me on at that time. So I have certainly understood your story well, and I'm proud to see you back here today.
Thank you.
Committee, brief questions. Brief. Representative Gross.
Chairman Lips to Mrs. Kazee.
Krinsky.
Krinsky.
Krinsky, yeah.
That's right. In your 30 years in nursing, 35 years in nursing, did you ever see a time when the staff transmitted the flu or any other disease to any place where you were employed?
No.
Thank you.
Representative Byrd.
Thank you, Chair. Nurse, thanks for being here. And my question is in regards to the employees' interests in seeing you take that vaccine. Do you think it's because that they have an interest in you being a healthy person and not calling in sick? Or is it because they have an interest in, for instance, say, stopping the spread of the flu between, say, you and another employer, but between you and a patient? Or you may have implied, I think, in your testimony that it might have been the reason for maybe an agreement between them and the vaccination producer. What are your thoughts on
No,
the
Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement.
What is the reason behind an employer sticking to that policy to the point of wanting to fire or terminate employees?
Well, I can say again, on a good year, 35 to 40% effectiveness rate is what they say for the flu shot. That effectiveness rate is not saying that you're not going to get it, but it's that amount of effectiveness for decreased doctor's visits. Not that you can't still get the virus and transmit the virus. Decreasing symptoms, just like the COVID shot. It's going to decrease symptoms, but not keep you from getting it or still transmitting it. We're professionals. We don't come to work when we're sick. The hospitals could really improve on allowing nurses to call in when they're sick and not penalizing them. That would be a huge step in keeping people well. Healthy people don't give viruses to other people, only if you're sick. And we have enough sense to stay home when we're sick. In the 29 years in the unit I was in, no one in that unit ever had the flu. And I must also say, to ever connect it back to a healthcare worker, when we have free and open visitation in our hospitals, and people are coming and going like a revolving door in the patient's rooms, how could you ever say a healthcare worker is going to give a patient a virus when they have so many visitations? I mean, to me, it's just, unless you put a guard at the front door and check everyone's vaccination status, which, I don't know, maybe it's going to come to that, but when I was working, free and open visitation for all patients without any kind of checking. So to say a healthcare worker is more apt to give a patient a flu when they're completely well. And I will tell you, in my case, I was the healthiest, I will say this, the healthiest person in my unit. I live a vegan lifestyle. I eat a plant-based diet. I exercise, get sun, fresh air, take my supplements. I prided myself on being healthy, never calling in sick because I was never sick. I rarely got colds. So to almost penalize someone who prides themselves on wellness and staying well, but yet my coworkers that are sucking down the Diet Cokes and eating donuts, but they're lining up and getting their shot, then, that's okay. Not to say they're not going to get sick. And I can also tell you the week of the flu shots, and you can probably check with any nurse that you know, the week of the flu shots, half of our unit would be sick. Upper respiratory infections, coughing, hacking, calling in. Now, did the hospital ever track that? No. All they care about is the check mark that you got your flu shot. They don't care if the flu shot made you sick. They're not going to keep track of that. And I can tell you that from year after year after year after year of seeing it happen. And I can tell you that my coworkers dreaded the week of the flu shots because they knew they would get sick. I mean, sick to the point of wheezing, coughing, needing to go to the ER for chest x-rays because they had whatever respiratory infection they got from receiving that injection. So what, they maybe don't have the official flu, but they had various other respiratory illnesses that they could as easily infect their patients with. But you also get penalized when you call in. So the hospital could really improve in that way to keep people well.
Ms. Krinsky, thank you very much for being with us today and sharing your testimony. I was concerned about your story when you were terminated, when we did 193, and I remain concerned about your story. I think the thing that upset me at that time was the same very hospital was advertising for nurses and trying to recruit nurses and yet letting quality 29-year nurses with a perfect file this big, a foot high of commendations, go. So thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
Committee, I will inform you that caucus is being delayed 10 minutes, so we're going to have just a few minutes here, and you may not be really late or miss much. Our final witnesses today will be Donna, Kazee. Thank you very much for being with us today. You may proceed.
All right. I have a big mouth, so hopefully you can hear me regardless if the microphone picks it up. Chair Lips, Vice Chair Holmes, Ranking Member Russo, and honorable members of the Health Committee, thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony in support of Sub-House Bill 248. I'm a former biomedical engineer, mother of two, and advocate for health freedom, consumer rights, and informed consent. I have two children with various medical conditions, some of which are associated with vaccine adverse events. Our son was born with an undetected bowel birth defect, malrotation, and shortly after he received his hepatitis B vaccine, he stopped breastfeeding and became very ill. His bowel had twisted on itself, a volvulus, and he ended up losing over 80% of his small intestine. We spent 11 weeks in the NICU. He endured 3 major bowel surgeries, central line placement, liver failure, and even an accidental narcotic overdose. If you've never seen an infant given Narcan, count yourself lucky, because it's pretty horrible. We were told he had about a 30% chance of making it to his first birthday, and if he did, he would need a small bowel and liver transplant by age 2. The odds were so stacked against him that when he went into liver failure, by the way, from his TPN, his total parenteral nutrition, and I asked to try a newly discovered therapy, I was told by the team of neonatologists and surgeons that probably the best thing to do was let him die. So often parents like myself with vulnerable kids are, not treated with very much respect, and the odds are against us, so why even bother? I'm like getting off key here. So like many mothers, when he did get out, I was told that we had to be extremely cautious because he had a secondary immunodeficiency due to the extreme shortcut. We spent weeks sanitizing, cleaning, screening visitors. Our whole lives were around making sure he didn't get sick. But yet after each set of vaccines, he got almost just like clockwork, respiratory, ear infection, developmental loss, By age 2, he was diagnosed with autism. That's my journey. The relatively recent argument has been that everyone else should be vaccinated to protect those immunocompromised individuals because they cannot be vaccinated. First, it should be realized that many immunocompromised individuals are partially or fully vaccinated, at most skipping the live virus vaccines, and some experienced vaccine injuries that caused or contributed to their immune issues. And I have referenced all of this. So one of the most heartbreaking advocacy calls I got was from the mother of a kid awaiting a transplant who was being told he must get caught up on certain vaccines. The hospital immunologist was only exempting him from the few vaccines he had received and reacted to as an infant. The child's own fears and his mother's concerns to be cautious were secondary to the medical team's demands. How is it that we have gone from patient-centered, individualized medicine to one-size-fits-all and doctor knows best or else? Because vaccines are tested and approved by healthy subjects, it is unknown what the effects will be on the larger, sicker population until they are released. As a doctor friend of mine says, nobody should die from preventive medicine. Balancing risk and benefits is a challenging process that should be done for each individual. How could I, nearly losing a child to vaccine injury and dealing with his lifelong disability, ask another parent to take that risk? Whose life is more valuable? Second, some vaccines shed. Prior to the 2015 Disneyland measles outbreak, Johns Hopkins had posted visitor guidelines for immunocompromised patients that excluded those recently vaccinated with live virus vaccines. The risk was well known and accepted. After a great deal of attention to the signs and printed guidelines, Johns Hopkins removed the live vaccine references. St. Jude still has the live vaccine references for the cancer and transplant patient care guidelines. Is it more important to convey a real risk or to preserve a narrative? Third, vaccines can and do fail, which is why we have boosters. We do not titer check routinely, so there is no way of knowing who is theoretically still protected by their vaccines. If vaccines conferred a magic bubble of protection around the vaccinated individual, and they don't because you can still transmit some infections by contact, then it would be important to know how many people were actually immune. Merck was sued by 2 researchers who alleged fraud with the efficacy data in the mumps portion of the MMR vaccine, but the trial outcome was private. The mumps outbreak on the USS Fort McHenry among fully vaccinated crew showed the world that vaccine failure is a reality. How are vaccinated people less of a threat then? I would also like to point out that the New York Yankees just experienced COVID vaccine breakthrough despite being fully vaccinated. 8 of them, 7 of them were asymptomatic. 1 was symptomatic, but you wouldn't expect many of them to be hit by COVID as much as the general population. Finally, vaccines may mask symptoms and contribute to outbreaks via asymptomatic spread and increased susceptibility. Pertussis vaccinated individuals can carry the infection and spread it to others, which drives the whooping cough outbreaks among highly vaccinated communities. Studies have shown that flu-vaccinated people can get the virus and shed it via passive respiration at a rate 6.3 times that of unvaccinated people with flu. A very recent Pentagon study showed that flu-vaccinated individuals are at higher risk for non-influenza respiratory infections, including coronaviruses. And another study indicated consecutive annual flu vaccination decreased its effectiveness. All of these situations mean that people who have been told that they are protected and safe can unknowingly put immunocompromised people at significant risk. Why is it acceptable to demand testing and restrictions for people who decline vaccination and to ignore blatant issues with transmission by the vaccinated? A few years ago, there was a picture circulating of an immunocompromised girl receiving immunoglobulin therapy after being exposed to chickenpox. The mother posted a follow-up as well after people asked whether the person who had chickenpox had been recently vaccinated. The mother said it did not matter. One of the main arguments for vaccinating everyone is to, hold on. I think I'm on the last one. I'm missing one of my pages. Anyway, okay. One of the main reasons or arguments for vaccinating everyone is so that you protect the immunocompromised. But I can tell you, there's relatively high vaccination rates in school. When my son was finally able to attend school in second grade, it was the mostly vaccinated and sick with other viruses, including flu breakthroughs, which happen frequently in schools despite kids being vaccinated. Coxsackie virus, pink eye, all of the other gastro flus and everything else that people carry around. Those were the ones that he ended up going. We have a vaccine manufacturers are not liable. We have a reporting system with no incentives or penalties for not reporting. How can we mandate and coerce a product under those conditions when it is estimated that only between 1 and 10% of vaccine adverse events, are being captured? How can we bully and penalize individuals taking away civil rights when we do not hold this data collection to the highest standards, knowing that people are risking their very lives? I urge each of you to vote yes for HB 248, the sub-bill, to affirm our inherent rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to reinforce the concept of medical freedom as found in the Ohio Constitution, and to align with patient rights to full informed consent as defined in the Nuremberg Code, the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, and medical ethics in general. There is risk and there must be choice. I am happy to answer any questions you have. Sorry, I stumbled. I'm missing a page of my testimony.
Thank you very much for submitting most of your testimony.
Thank you.
We appreciate you and your story. Committee members, any additional questions? Oh, committee members that are leaving, caucuses have been moved to 15th floor in the Rife Majority Caucus Room. Any questions for our witness? I have one. How do people, the common person, their pediatrician, their family physician, the school just gives you your vaccine protocol program for your child? How does the common person then find out, my child is injured, there's a vaccine injury compensation? How do they find out about such a program?
I think that varies. I can tell you absolutely it was not through the healthcare professionals that we learned about VAERS. Vaccine injury was denied in my son's case until it could be denied no longer. And then after we stopped vaccinating and he stopped having all of the weird infections he was having and developmental delays, they said, clearly you shouldn't vaccinate again. Nobody reported to VAERS for him. Nobody reported to VAERS with my daughter's 2-month reaction. I was threatened. In fact, we were dismissed by the pediatrician that we were seeing for suggesting that she had had a vaccine reaction. We were told to go to the emergency room. No one there reported it. So in terms of knowing about vaccine injury reality and VAERS and a vaccine injury compensation program, it's not coming from the medical providers. I think it's coming from fellow parents in most of the cases. Every once in a while you get an aware medical provider. You have some of the situations are that they're in hospitals where the neuro team happens to know that Guillain-Barré is a symptom of flu shot. My father was recently in for vascular issues, and the first thing they asked, because we brought him in suspecting stroke, was did he have his COVID shot? Because that, at least COVID, has increased awareness that there can be adverse events. And I honestly, instead of calling people anxious and dismissing their concerns, because all of us parents of vaccine-injured kids and all of us vaccine-injured people have been through this, I would call that gaslighting. To me, that's dismissing concerns. It's not following up. So our cases are not in VAERS. Neither of my kids' injuries are in VAERS, and that's just the tip of the iceberg.
With the pharmaceutical and medical industries not wanting to discuss vaccine injuries like they don't exist, even though I think they do, How many people actually go through the process? How many parents throw their hands up? They don't know what to do. How many parents actually go through this process on a percentage basis of injury?
I'm not sure that that's knowable, but I believe that only of the small percentage who go through the process, only 25% ever make it fully through vaccine injury court. And then you're talking like 5 to 10 years, as Ann Abbott explained earlier. The Government Accounting Office, you can look up the report on the vaccine injury system, said it was an incredibly cumbersome system that, pretty much penalized and put all the onus on the person coming before. And so the government both, provides the payment for the lawyers and then represents itself in the system, so it's a total kangaroo court. And unless you have an injury that's on the table that happens within the specific time frame, chances are you're going to get dismissed.
So it's almost like it's the family's fault. It's like there's a liability-free product, there's walls put up at every step, but it's the family's fault.
It feels very much like that, and it feels very much like a discriminatory system. And not to mention, Representative Lips, thank you for asking me the questions. A lot of the vaccines were made on the backs of disabled people. Willow, the hepatitis B, was made being injected into children with very significant disabilities in Willowbrook Institute. In fact, the doctor who developed the hepatitis B vaccine, the way they got parents to sign their disabled kids up to be tested like guinea pigs was to offer them access to a clean floor with a lot of care. So we have a history of this. Obstetrics is based on the deaths and horrible mutilation of slaves. Medicine has to come to terms with its bad side, its dark side, and we have to put the patient back in the center again.
Who funds the vaccine injury compensation program?
We do. Taxpayers, a tax on each vaccine.
Do the
Given.
pharmaceutical companies or the health industry?
No, not at all. Via the Act, they are completely removed from financial responsibility and only have financial reward from vaccines.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Committee, you did a great job. Audience, you did a great job. I will say that the main testimony room gallery was much better behaved than the people in overflow. So we'll say that. Anything in closing? The committee, thank you very much. You may get to your committee. We are adjourned.